Why central planning is humanity's greatest catastrophe. Hey everyone! Welcome back to our series exploring Roland Baader's Kreide für den Wolf, Chalk for the Wolf. This second part turns to the triumph of the planners and the fierce defense of free markets against layers of distortion and myth. Imagine the long historical arc where the idea of society as a blank canvas for elite designers finally gains the upper hand. From ancient dreams of perfect states to modern environmental zeal, a certain moral vision treats human beings and their interactions as raw material to be molded into an ideal shape. This totalitarian morality doesn't announce itself as oppression. It wraps itself in the language of justice, equality, and the greater good, insisting that only central direction can overcome the messiness of voluntary cooperation. Logically, any such approach must first assume that the planners possess knowledge superior to the dispersed decisions of millions, yet that assumption collapses the moment you examine incentives and information. When power concentrates to enforce the vision, dissent becomes immorality, and the system hardens into coercion justified by noble ends. Counters claiming this is merely necessary coordination for complex problems fail because they ignore the track record. Every expansion of planning authority creates new problems that demand even more planning, locking societies into escalating control rather than solving root issues through adaptive freedom. If this hits you deep, those raw historical truths or those light bulb moments, drop a comment, tell a friend, and stick around for more. At the center stands the claim that social science and economic planning represent the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history. Merck's ALS Wissenschaft, or botched work masquerading as rigorous inquiry. These fields promise mastery over social outcomes through models, statistics, and interventions, yet they rest on the pretense that complex orders can be measured, predicted, and directed like laboratory experiments. Reason dismantles this thoroughly. Genuine science deals with testable, falsifiable claims in controlled settings, whereas planning pretends to aggregate subjective values, future uncertainties, and billions of daily choices into computable equations. The result is not knowledge but illusion, where elegant theories justify real-world damage through unintended consequences, distorted incentives, and suppressed feedback. Opposing arguments that point to isolated successes or evidence-based policy crumble under scrutiny because they selectively ignore the systemic failures, the politicization of data, and the impossibility of isolating variables in open human systems. Logic demands we recognize pseudoscience by its fruits. Repeated predictions that miss, interventions that worsen the problems they target, and an endless demand for more resources to fix prior mistakes. This victory of the constructors extends into the legal realm, where lawyers and jurists have become the gravediggers of the rule of law. Instead of upholding general, predictable rules that apply equally and allow spontaneous order to flourish, modern legal thinking shifts toward specific legislation aimed at desired outcomes. Constructivist intervention by another name. The Rechtsstaat, that framework of impartial law protecting individual spheres, erodes as courts and legislators treat law as a tool for social engineering. Pure reasoning shows why this shift is fatal. When rules become instruments of particular ends rather than stable boundaries, predictability vanishes, investment in long-term plans becomes reckless, and power concentrates in those who interpret the rules. Counters defending activist jurisprudence as evolving with society miss the distinction between organic adaptation through custom and top-down imposition that serves transient political goals. The logic is clear: general rules enable freedom, particular commands enable control. Key concepts like democracy, justice, equality, and the state suffer chronic misunderstanding that turns them into weapons against liberty. Democracy gets elevated from a practical mechanism for limiting power into a mystical source of unlimited authority, where majority will justify any intrusion. Justice mutates from impartial protection of rights into enforced redistribution of outcomes. Equality shifts from equality before the law to equality of results, requiring constant state violence against natural differences in talent, effort, and choice. The state itself transforms in the mind from night watchman to omnipotent provider and shaper. Each distortion serves the planners by expanding legitimate grounds for intervention. These misuses don't survive logical examination. True democracy functions best when constrained by higher principles that prevent it from devouring the rights it exists to protect. Genuine justice recognizes earned differences rather than punishing them. Real equality under law leaves outcomes to voluntary interaction. Attempts to redefine these terms for collectivist purposes always lead back to the same error, substituting the planner's preferences for individual judgment. At the core of the book's defense lies the misunderstood idol: free markets as the indispensable foundation of freedom and genuine democracy. Far from being a mere economic arrangement, voluntary exchange coordinates knowledge, rewards value creation, and disperses power in ways no central authority can match. It is the economic expression of respect for individual autonomy, where success depends on serving others rather than commanding them. This system doesn't require perfection or omniscience. It harnesses self-interest within rules of property and contract to generate prosperity and innovation as byproducts. Counters that portray free markets as sources of exploitation or instability ignore the historical pattern. Periods of greater economic freedom consistently deliver rising living standards, technological leaps, and social mobility, while planning breeds stagnation and privilege for the connected. Logic here is decisive. Without voluntary cooperation tested daily in the marketplace, there is no reliable mechanism for discovering what people truly value or allocating resources efficiently. Attacks on free markets are ultimately attacks on the practical expression of human liberty itself. The industrial era gets buried under 5 persistent legends that distort reality. The notion of mass impoverishment, uncontrolled population explosions dooming the poor, pure greed driving progress, widespread exploitation of children, and the myth of a pure laissez-faire night watchman era that supposedly failed. Each legend inverts cause and effect or cherry-picks data while ignoring broader gains in wages, life expectancy, literacy, and choice. Reason shreds them one by one. Real improvements in worker conditions came from productivity rises enabled by free exchange, not despite it. Population growth reflected falling death rates from better nutrition and medicine. Profits signaled value delivered to consumers. Child labor declined as families grew wealthier under market pressures, and the supposed minimal state was always more interventionist than romanticized. These myths persist not because of evidence but because they serve the narrative that only planning can correct market failures. Dismantling them restores the truth that free markets lifted billions by aligning incentives with human creativity. The greatest lie crowns them all. The claim that fascism and similar authoritarian systems were expressions of free markets or authority-oriented extremes, when in reality they represented variants of Marxism, centralized control, suppression of voluntary exchange, and fusion of state and corporate power under collectivist banners. This inversion hides the common root in constructivist planning and hostility to spontaneous order. Logical analysis reveals the shared DNA. Both prioritize the collective over the individual, command over contract, and political power over market discovery. Attempts to separate them ideologically collapse when examined against actual policies: nationalization, price controls, conscription of labor, and rejection of individual rights. Recognizing this continuity strips away the convenient scapegoating and forces honest confrontation with the recurring threat of statism in any disguise. Several striking passages drive these points with precision. One exposes how the planners' moral vision turns society into putty for their ideals. Another details the pseudoscientific pretensions that have caused more harm than any natural disaster. Passages on the corruption of law and the twisting of core concepts reveal the quiet mechanisms of erosion. The defense of free markets as liberty's practical form shines with clarity, while the takedown of the industrial legends and the fascism myth cuts through decades of propaganda with unrelenting logic. Taken together, these themes reveal a decisive historical contest: the planner's vision of engineered society versus the emergent order of free human action. The analysis stands firm because it rests on fundamental realities: limited knowledge, incentive alignment, and the superior information processing power of decentralized choice. It challenges us to see through the myths and reclaim the intellectual ground that free markets alone can sustain. If this examination of the planner's victories and free market realities resonates, the final part of the series confronts the new forms of collectivism and the deeper warnings for our time. Pick up the book, wrestle with these ideas, and carry the clarity forward. Thanks for joining. Until next time, stay curious and think critically. Stay free.